make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Concerning sign is there may indeed be a majority on the U.S. Supreme Court that does not have a problem with public religious schools and who will use what I think is a very distorted line of cases and reasoning that to say that public money cannot fund religion is somehow discriminatory towards religion. It really turns on its head the experience that animated the founders, their experience of established religion, their experience that government funding is actually quite bad for religion and religious pluralism, and they made a different choice, and that choice seems to be being reconsidered in this case. So I'm very concerned about that case. The Supreme Court will hear argument in it in late April.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching us on our YouTube channel, we are so glad to have you. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I am joined by my partner in crime, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks, Will.
And returning to us today is Amanda Tyler. She is a distinguished American lawyer and executive, serving as the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which is in D.C. And she does a lot of really, really great stuff out there, which I'm sure we will talk about here in a second. But she's also the lead organizer of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, co-hosts the Respecting Religion podcast, and has a book called How to End Christian Nationalism. And we are just so glad to have you back, Amanda. Welcome back to the show.
Oh, thanks so much. So happy to return to the show.
Yeah. So just, I don't know if you remember the last time you were here, but it was with Brian Kaler, and we were talking about Kennedy, the whole Kennedy thing.
Kennedy v. Bremerton or whatever?
Not RFK Kennedy, but like Kennedy.
Coach Kennedy. Yes.
Coach Kennedy. Yes.
No relation.
No relation. And what's even weirder was the last time we saw you was when you were in Richmond. You were doing a book thing there.
I know you were right on the front row, but I didn't get a chance to talk to you after.
We wanted to be seen, actually, because like we so rarely meet folks that have been on the show in person, and it's like a really weird experience because we're going to the AU summit like at the first week of April, and I'm just like, oh, it's gonna be weird, like just being like in a 3-dimensional space.
All
These
your
are real
social
people.
Anxieties are going to come out and come spewing.
So it is weird. Anyways, but yeah, so glad to have you back. So I guess maybe before we get started, like how is your book being received? Like what are kind of, some of the things that you're hearing about your book? Have people actually figured out how to end Christian nationalism?
Yeah. So the spoiler alert I have for my book is at the very end, I say, if you've made it this far, you're not going to end Christian nationalism by reading a book, even this one. So, but I do think the feedback I'm getting from people who have read the book, people I'm meeting on the book tour, which is continuing, is that it is a helpful resource. It's something that is broadly accessible, and that it gives people some ideas on what to do next. And I'm a first-time book author, so it's so gratifying. You work so hard on this work, and then you just have all these doubts along the way, like, is this even adding anything? Is this something that's necessary? Why am I spending all this time? And so then to have people that I've actually met to say, thank you, this is really helpful, is amazing. And I'll just say, so the book came out October 22nd, a few weeks before the presidential election day in the fall. And so I had this really interesting experience that the book tour started before the election and then has continued after it. And I did have a lot of interest before, but it was kind of like this nervous energy that I would feel in the crowds. And now when people come to the events, people are there for a reason. They're like, tell me what I can do. Show me, like, what can I do to get involved? And that has been really exciting. And just tiny anecdote, but this weekend, I was actually at an event in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, with a group of Lutherans, and I met a couple who had come in from Ohio, and they said, we are from like deep MAGA country, Ohio, and I put your book on a waiting list for my public library, and I'm number 45 in line to get your book. And I was like, wow. Like that was so, that's like some of the best news that I've heard, since I've been on the book tour, so that the people are really reaching out and thinking that this could be a good resource for them in places that I've never even visited before.
That's so cool. And congratulations, by the way, I didn't realize this was your first book.
It is.
Is that what you said? That's so cool. And I just think it's great that you're able to get that kind of feedback. I haven't written a book yet. Hopefully one day. I'm thinking about it, but I have written a very long thesis, and I asked myself, what the heck am I doing this for? At least at that point, I knew I was going to get a grade. But I'm like, this is like so much work and it's so much stress. And it's like, is this going to do anything? And at least that got me a master's degree. So, but, I think it's awesome that you're getting the feedback that you are. I'm curious to hear, have you heard any feedback that's like legitimate feedback from critics, like people that are looking at it and they're kind of like giving you any responses, but well, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? Like, I'm not talking about the people that are like, this is terrible, this is awful, whatever, just saying nothing of substance. But have you heard anything from any critics that you thought were, oh, that's interesting, I would think about that? Or maybe even what do you imagine they might say?
Yeah, I mean, I think one criticism, which I get, is that it's not a very long book, first of all, and that was by design because I wanted something that people would actually read and that was accessible to them. And so I have to be a little bit surface at different areas, because if I'm really going to cover all the things I want to cover in this book, I can't really go deep on everything. And I have a appendix in the back that I actually have recommended reading. And so the idea is, if you want to go deeper, like, one book cannot be all things to all people. So one of the criticisms was kind of like, she's not really saying, they're books that are better on like kind of diagnosing the problem of Christian nationalism. And look, I fully agree with that, honestly, but that wasn't really my aim in the book. And so I don't mean that in a defensive way. I'm like, if that's what you're looking for, this isn't the book for you. This is really more of a book for people who know enough about the problem to want to do something about it. And that my hope is the book might give language to be able to talk about the problem with other people, but also concrete ideas on places to get started. And so that was kind of my aim, but I want to be very clear that there are better books out there on kind of the history of Christian nationalism or the politics of Christian nationalism or even the theology of Christian nationalism. I was looking more for kind of a how-to guide in some ways for people who really were a little bit stuck. What do I do about it? And so that's kind of, and that's in the structure of the book. That's why the chapters are steps. And even the title of the book is meant to be something that is more like a guidebook than an academic treatise.
I love it. So for those who have never heard of the book and our listeners, and it's a wide range of people we have, we've talked about Christian nationalism like almost ad nauseum on our channel because it's so important to us, and we feel very strongly about understanding it. We feel very strongly about right-sizing it and understanding its real effect on our country, and even going into the nuances of, well, as someone who goes to church and wants to, votes Republican, are they a Christian nationalist because they vote Republican? And, just the kinds of things that people start thinking, the kinds of, shortcuts they start taking. And so we've talked about this quite a bit, but help us understand, again, we've defined this several times, but even your unique take on what Christian nationalism is and why it's such a big deal for anyone listening to this to care about, spend time wondering about, get the book, read it. Essentially, why should they care about Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so the definition that I use in the book and have used in the campaign is a very broad one. I define Christian nationalism in the U.S. context as a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge Christian and American identities into one. Or put another way, that Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, one has to be a Christian, and not just any kind of Christian, but often a Christian who holds fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with certain conservative political priorities. I totally agree with you that just to have conservative political priorities does not mean that you are embracing Christian nationalism, right? But to think that to be a real American, that you have to share the same views and that those views are in line with this fundamentalist reading of the Bible, that is a sign of Christian nationalism. And what I'm trying to do with the and then I go, more in depth and draw on a lot of different scholars and social science surveys and history and historians to kind of tell how this is a very old problem in the United States, a problem that completely overlaps with white supremacy as well. But I really am trying to give space for every reader to identify in themselves, like, where are places in my life that I might have embraced this ideology? Or where are there places that I firmly rejected the ideology? I think the one critique that I have of kind of a lot of the national conversation around Christian nationalism is even the use of Christian nationalist as a label. People use it almost like an immutable characteristic. Oh, that person's a Christian nationalist, I can't talk to them. As opposed to thinking about it right. as an ideology and a framework that is just present in American society. And that to live here is to, in some ways, to have been impacted by it. Not all of us have embraced it to the same degree as others, or rejected it to the same degree as others, or been sympathetic or resisted it. But we are all kind of in it. And I think that prevents a furthering of an us versus them mentality that, frankly, is really pushed by a Christian nationalist ideology. And so I'm hopeful that that kind of broader frame might provide a basis for deeper and more productive conversations around the topic.
That's really cool. And apologies in advance if my camera, if there's a delay. I'm having some issues on our end, but as long as you can hear me okay, that's all that matters. Okay, good. So I love for you to just kind of make sense of this anti-Christian bias task force that seemed to be pretty high on the priority list for the incoming administration. So make it make sense how the biggest religion in the world has structural biases against it.
Okay, so I cannot make this executive order make logical sense, but I can maybe make sense of why this has been placed as such a high priority by the administration. We've had this onslaught of executive action over the first several weeks of the Trump administration, and one of those was in early February to sign an order creating a task force to, quote, eradicate anti-Christian bias. First off, this administration spent their first couple of weeks trying to scrub any office that had anything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion out of the federal government, out of federal contracting, and now even going into the private sector, right? So that really shows, I think, what the administration actually thinks about countering bias, right? If they really cared about anti-religious bias, they would not have gone after offices like these. They certainly don't care about anti-religious bias on a large scale because a lot of these offices actually dealt very much with that issue. But they are really perpetuating this false claim that there's rampant anti-Christian bias in our culture, in what is a majority Christian country. And I find this really offensive on a number of levels. I mean, one, it really distracts and denigrates from the very real anti-Christian bias and persecution that happens in countries around the world today, right? That there actually is a problem with Christian persecution in other countries, and to equate people who feel that their views are not reflected in law and policy, to call that bias is really a misnomer from the beginning. And does not require a government task force. It also really downplays, and I think is very insulting to the very real anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bias, anti-Sikh bias, anti-Hindu bias, like any other religion in this country that is marginalized from having mainstream access, being accepted in the mainstream, being tolerated, and certainly having full religious freedom. The levels of all of that anti-religious bias are far higher than any kind of anti-Christian bias, particularly when you consider the numbers of how many people in this country actually claim that religion. So by a proportional number, I mean, any kind of anti-Christian bias is minuscule compared to all of these others. And we really need serious policies to deal with that. And by the way, serious policies to deal with anti-Semitism are not to marginalize free speech, people who don't agree with the policies of the administration, right? We've seen how anti-Semitism has been, and a fight against anti-Semitism has been weaponized to go after political enemies as well. But what I really think is happening with this task force is setting up a structure to enforce a kind of theological conformity on everyone. That it's not, as I said, just all Christians. That the examples given in the executive order were actually people who had been criminally prosecuted for interfering with women's ability to get lawful abortions at clinics around the country, and actually claiming that their criminal prosecution was an evidence of anti-Christian bias, and then actually pardoning people who some of whom were still serving jail sentences for criminal conduct, right? And so that shows that it's not just all views that this task force is going to be looking at, but really elevating certain interpretations of Scripture and certain interpretations of and expressions of Christianity over others. And that, coupled with what we've seen from this administration these first few weeks, should raise real concerns for people who care about religious freedom and free speech in this country and free expression, including Christians, because this administration has been going after Christians like Bishop Marianne Buddy, who dared to preach a prophetic word directly to the president, and to Lutheran social service organizations who had contracts with the federal government to provide aid around the world, and to the U.S. Catholic Church, who, were standing up and expressing their dissatisfaction with the government's policies towards immigrant communities. All of these groups became the target of attacks from this administration and their supporters in ways that show that there isn't really a commitment to anti-religious bias, and that this looks more like the instrument of an authoritarian theocracy.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you explained it that way, because you literally took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, like when I saw the executive order, all I could think about is like, this is just another perpetuation of, I don't know, like Project Blitz, or like this is one of the mountains of the seven, and it just really kind of broke my heart, because it's like, sure, it may be called anti-Christian bias, but really it's a to hell with your religious pluralism committee, because to your point, like I think that it's an attempt to kind of make the country more Christian, which as a Christian like really sucks, because that's not how you're supposed to do it. So and it's a certain kind of Christianity, right? It's not a Christianity that we would even all ascribe to, those of us who are Christians.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a lot of the concern with Christian nationalism and its expression, in the sense that you have to be a Christian in order to be a good American. In order to be a good American, in order to be a good Christian, you have to be like American. In order to be a good American, you have to be a Christian, or some I know that's an oversimplification of it, but that is very, very concerning. And I do have this pushback in me, though, just thinking about, one, I'm supposed to be the conservative voice on here. So it's trying to think about, what might my friends think if they heard that, but another thing is that, I would love for you to help me understand the difference between what Trump is doing coming in and saying, hey, these DEI things under a certain interpretation of what those are, right? So they talk about I don't even know what the list of the reasons why DEI has become a target. Those would be an interesting argument to hear, what are people saying, that it's forcing this kind of ideology, or it's some kind of required, maybe they feel like it's coercive in some way, or that it's wasteful in some way, or whatever. And, when you have things like diversity, equity, inclusion put in there, right, those are words that anyone hears, and not anyone. I mean, again, that's an overgeneralization, but someone might hear someone like me, I'm well, those are good things, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And yet the content of what's in those, sometimes, you can put questionable content behind good words or good sounding words, and that might even be part of the strategy. I'm not necessarily saying that is the case here. I'm very ignorant in this, right? So I would, that's kind of why I'm asking the question. I think about the Obama administration, and some of the issues they had with the HSS mandate, or, Obamacare, with, abortion. And, I guess if I'm remembering correctly, the Hobby Lobby sued the government, or that got to the Supreme Court they were trying to force payment of abortion. Again, correct any misunderstanding I'm having, right? I'm not an expert in this. But those kinds of, if I think about someone who's working through this, and they're they might say, well, how come a Catholic organization might be forced to close, or forced to, put the children in same-sex couples, when that to them is a violation of their religious freedom and their rights and all that stuff. But that seems like an ideological push to close that. Yeah, I guess what's the difference between that, or the kinds of things we've seen in other administrations, versus what this current administration is doing? It kind of feels in some ways we've all just gotten into this. I'm going to force this on you through government coercion and power, and you're going to like it or you're not. And now we just have another swing of the pendulum where this really, conservative. And again, I'm not a big Trump fan. I mean, anyone who's listened to this knows that, but it's I'm trying to almost understand what is the fear? Why is this so, what's different between what he's doing and say what Obama did, or what Biden did, or maybe presidents before him?
Yeah.
I'm super curious to hear.
Yeah, no, and I think it's good to have what's the other side, not the other side, but what's the argument here? And I think one thing, you kind of got to it right at the beginning, and I do want to talk about religious exemptions and prior government policies. That's we could have a whole hour just on that topic, honestly.
Oh, man, I would love to talk about that.
But I do want to get to that. But first, just kind of focusing on programs that are meant to further diversity, equity, and inclusion, meant to further this ideal that everyone belongs. Right. And that and which I think is really core to a functioning pluralistic democracy. And I think what we have with this current administration, we have a lot of different things to point to, even in just the last couple of weeks, but they are not committed to pluralism. They actually don't, I think, and whether they're committed to democracy seems like a very open question to me too. But pluralism is just not. Instead, there is this idea of a white Christian nationalism, right? And that there are certain people who really belong here, and there are others who don't, right? And that's furthered in a lot of ways. And this didn't just happen overnight. But for
Sure.
years, there's been this attack, and it was a very real thing to say. You never hear them say diversity, equity, inclusion. You hear DEI because people don't even know what that means. And you hear woke, right? And people don't even know what that means, right? But there's this whole kind of conflation and kind of scare tactics about what's actually going on in these offices that is a long way from what's actually going on in these offices. Now, has there been government overreach or just dumb programs along the way? I'm sure there have been, as there are at every level. And could we tweak and make more effective some of these programs? Absolutely. And can we legislate or program our way out of some of these deeply seated ideologies? No. We need the programs, but we also need people who are willing to come along and do the work and be present and be in communities. So I think the response of just blaming government or these offices, and again, this is now extended into the private sector. Now we're seeing private companies who are shutting down their own initiatives for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or under threat that the government will come after them in some way if they don't. So this has gone far beyond the power of the executive, again, in ways that I think are really moving into an authoritarian regime type, where we're having a lot of thought control coming from the leader of the country as opposed to a kind of free society we're wanting to live in. Yeah, so I'm really glad you brought up the question of religious exemptions from the prior administration, because what really happened in that case was the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, had a requirement under the new plans that contraceptive coverage would be free of charge, and that the insurance companies that were providing that had to cover those costs. And some religious, because most people in this country continue to get their health insurance from their employers, some of the religious employers objected. They said, look, this violates our conscience to have to provide insurance that would permit contraceptive care and reproductive health care. And so the Obama administration said, we'll work with you, right? We'll come up with a workaround. And they came up with a workaround, and those religious employers continue to say no, that they wouldn't take yes for an answer. And literally at the end of the day, it was sign this form that says you will not provide it and we'll find someone else who will. And they said to sign that form makes us complicit in the sin of receiving contraceptive care. And so I think and somehow that whole story got reduced to the Obama administration is trying to force employers to provide abortions and contraceptive care, when that was not at all the case, right? And so I think we really need to have more understanding about what's going on and get out of the sound bites of really demonizing one side or the other in this case, and learn more about what's really happening.
I'm gonna break the fourth wall here for a second to say that, and apologies for anybody that's watching this. Hopefully the video will sync to the audio at some point in time, but this has got to be driving you crazy, Amanda. So sorry. But for those that were unable to tell that we just edited a section of this interview, something you said that the second time I heard it did not make it any better about the signing it and being complicit with birth control. Our listeners are going to hear that, and that'll be the first time they heard it. I've heard it twice, and even that second time I was like, that is just ridiculous. What? I don't get it. But my question to you, Amanda, though, is new administration, the makeup of the Supreme Court is a lot different since the last time you and I spoke on the pod. What are some court cases that you and BJC are kind of following, monitoring? And are you all doing anything with what's happening with Oklahoma and Ryan Walters?
Yeah. Great questions. Lots going on at the Supreme Court. They took a bit of a break last year from religion clause cases, not a break from handing down decisions, but from the cases that we are most directly involved in. But they're back at it this year. And there's a case also out of the state of Oklahoma that we are closely watching. I guess before I get into it, I do want to say at this moment that I think is very perilous for American democracy. And as a lawyer myself, I am very heartened by the level of illegal activity that's happening right now, both by the number of lawsuits that are being filed and by the relative speed that the cases are being adjudicated and coming down, right? You know, they're not happening overnight, nor could they if they're really going to be thoughtful decisions. But I think what we're seeing, at least to this point, is Article 3 judiciary holding up their end of the constitutional bargain, right? And I think we need to see Article 1 Congress holding up their end of the constitutional bargain as well. But I'm on team judiciary right now, and I had been a little down on the judiciary before this year. But the U.S. Supreme Court, so lots of very important cases there. But one that we are going to be filing a brief in comes out of the state of Oklahoma, where there is an attempt to have a religious public charter school. Right? We have private religious schools in this country, but to date, we have not had public religious schools. And that's because there is this foundational constitutional idea in this country that public money does not fund religion. Now, that principle has been chipped away at for a number of years by this U.S. Supreme Court, going at least back, and I mean, probably further back than this, but really to 2017. There have been a series of cases where the Supreme Court has cut away at that foundational idea. And now that principle is being tested in the most extreme way that we've seen so far in saying, can the state of Oklahoma with their public money fund a religious school and call it it be a public school? So this case, there's a Catholic charter school, and the state of Oklahoma's Supreme Court had struck it down. They took their state constitution based on these same principles. And in their state constitution, it basically says public schools shall not be sectarian, right? So it's pretty clear on the face, and said, therefore, this is unconstitutional under Oklahoma law. The state attorney general in Oklahoma, who is a Republican, right? This is not some liberal enclave, right? Also firmly said, we do not have public religious schools. And so it's very concerning that the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, actually, we want to hear that case. This concerning sign is there may indeed be a majority on the U.S. Supreme Court that does not have a problem with public religious schools, and who will use what I think is a very distorted line of cases and reasoning, that to say that public money cannot fund religion is somehow discriminatory towards religion. It really turns on its head the experience that animated the founders, their experience of established religion, their experience that government funding is actually quite bad for religion and religious pluralism. And they made a different choice. And that choice seems to be being reconsidered in this case. So very concerned about that case. The Supreme Court will hear argument in it in late April. And we'll be talking quite a bit more about it on the podcast that I co-host called Respecting Religion. The other case that we're watching that's actually still working its way through the courts is coming out of the state of Louisiana. Louisiana became the first state in modern times to pass a law that requires the posting of the Ten Commandments in public school classrooms. And to date, again, that law, the district court, because there is precedent in this case, because in 1980, similar law came up and the Supreme Court at that time said, nope, that's unconstitutional. You can't do it. But after the Kennedy versus Bremerton case, the case that we talked about previously on this podcast, they're using the reasoning in that case to try to go after that old precedent and try to
the limit test.
That's right. So in the Kennedy case, among other things, the court, in an opinion authored by Justice Gorsuch, basically said no more lemon test. Lemon test was one framework to try to determine if statute or government action violated the Establishment Clause. But they did not go back and invalidate other cases. But people who are challenging it are saying because there is no more lemon test, any prior case that used the lemon test is also bad law. Which I think is faulty reasoning, but they're going to give it another go, and they're going to try to give it a go under what Justice Gorsuch replaced it with, which is this very vague history and tradition test. So they're trying to make a case that it was the history and tradition of the United States to post 10 Commandments in every public school classroom, and therefore that there's no problem with doing that now. I think it's going to be very hard to build that history case before the court, but they're certainly giving it a go. I'll say that the district court, they lost at the district court. It is currently pending before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. BJC filed a brief in that case. And so we're watching very closely and assume that at some point this case will end up at the U.S. Supreme Court as well.
Wow, man. I'm just like imagining having the 10 Commandments posted in my classroom as a high school student. I'm like, I was in Fairfax County, it was right outside of DC. And I was like, that would just have been unimaginable, even though probably at the time I would have been like, oh yeah, that would be great. Or my parents would have been in support of that. And now it's hard to believe, but I'm like, man, I understand why people, I get it, why people are so adamant about it and also afraid of it. And I feel the tension inside. And ultimately, I agree. If we were to have some kind of, movement to post different surahs of the Quran or surah number 1, in every, school in the United States of America, I can only imagine the uproar. And so just trying to think of it in those ways. And we need to maintain this kind of neutrality, but of course it's very difficult, right? And it's one of the things, you're addressing in your book is Christian nationalism and the need for pluralism, which I very much am sympathetic to that. More so than I've ever been in my life as a conservative, Republican, a pastor, an evangelical, but just seeing the need for that. But I do wonder, I can imagine some critics saying something like, well, modern, secularism, it's actually its own dominant ideology. It's turned into an ideology that marginalizes traditional faith communities, whatever it might be. And you can imagine even some of the views from Orthodox Jews, Orthodox Muslims, and Orthodox Christians might come into conflict with some of the more progressive views that we've seen, become more mainstream and even more. I'm at a loss for the word that I'm looking for, but essentially more accepted and even more enshrined in law. And so, what do you like? We talked a little bit about this, how there's not really this religious persecution that's being that's really the evidence isn't there for that. But how do you respond to those who maybe are feeling excluded? They might feel attacked by holding historic Christian beliefs. Like if someone's coming to you and they're saying, Amanda, man, I don't know what to do. I have these traditional views that I'm holding, and I feel like I'm honest about that. I might be risking my job, or I might. And of course, now in this administration, they're probably not feeling that nearly as much because of what's happening. But maybe they could have been feeling that under the Obama administration, under Biden, and I'm assuming under a future Democrat, president. Who knows? But what is what do you say to people like that? Have you had those conversations? What do they normally look like? And using kind of the argument from your book to help understand that.
Yeah. Well, I think in a conversation like that, first I'd really want to listen well to what I'm hearing and to ask and to really get to often a lot of this is based in a sense of fear, right? Fear is a universal
yes
human emotion, right? And to understand what is the fear here and what's really going on. And then, just to give an example of kind of how we see this playing out, right, is, and something that we've seen play out over, a relatively short amount of time. We went from the Defense of Marriage Act. This is like in my adulthood, right? We went from the Defense of Marriage Act, which put in law basically that only opposite sex marriages would be recognized for all kinds of legal benefits, right? To Obergefell, where it became a constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry, right? That was a relatively quick, change for constitutional rights. And then we've seen all kinds of other legal protections follow from that, right? Now, we know that not every person in this country holds a religious belief that accords with that secular right, right? And I think this is where the neutrality of government comes into place, right? Just because same-sex couples and may marry and their marriages will be legally recognizable does not mean the government is forcing anyone into a same-sex marriage, right? One does not have to marry someone from the same sex, nor do religious institutions have to marry them, right? And I think this is also the piece. When we think about marriage, we have a legal institution of marriage and we have a religious institution of marriage. Those are two different things. This is where I think the separation of church and state is very helpful to think about this. And so while there is a legal right to marry, there is not a religious right to marry, right? It's not that anyone has a right to walk into any religious institution and demand to be married by that religious institution. And that religious freedom has been defended and protected, and I continue to defend and protect that right to tell the difference between religious marriage and civil marriage. And so I think there's a lot in the culture right now about LGBTQ rights. And specifically now, I think transgender people have been singled out as scapegoats and as examples in a lot of different issues where a lot of untruths and exaggerations and all kinds of demonization have happened with that particular community. And it has been fueled in part by this idea that one's religious views are under attack. And again, Will asked me earlier, make logical sense of this for me. I cannot make logical sense of this for you, but these are the emotions that are being played on and being played into in this moment. And so I think just because one has a religious conviction, one does not have a right for that religious conviction to be reflected in law and policy. Right? Our laws and policies are meant to serve everyone and not reflect any one religious view over another. And we have space, including through religious exemptions, which we were talking about earlier. We have a legal system that makes space for people to hold on to their religious convictions and not be forced by the government to take actions that conflict with them. And there are sometimes very complicated legal questions about how we weigh different rights together, right? And those are when the hard cases sometimes come to the U.S. Supreme Court. And we can disagree about some of the outcomes and whether the court got it right in weighing those different rights. And I'm not trying to simplify those, but I do think the key piece is that religious freedom does not mean that your views are necessarily reflected in law and policy. But does law and policy give you space to live into your religious convictions and to exercise your faith in ways that don't interfere with the rights of other people living in our pluralistic society?
That's really good. My last question for you, because I know you're a busy lady, is we have a lot of our audience members ask us if we have signed our name to the Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And my most common response is no, but I'll take a look at it. And it's not like I haven't looked at it. It's just like we're lazy and we're busy, and it's just like. But I want to give you the opportunity to tell every one of our listeners, people that are watching this, like, what is Christians Against Christian Nationalism, and why is it a good thing for them just to kind of sign up and be a part of this movement?
Yeah. I appreciate the question. So the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign is something that BJC manages, and we have a website, christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. When we started this campaign way back in 2019, the centerpiece was the statement of principles that we invited people to sign on to. And anyone listening who claims a Christian identity is welcome to review it and sign if they would like. And I also want to say it's not the only way to connect with the campaign. So there are lots of people who don't claim a Christian identity and don't want to sign on in that way, or people who just don't want a name publicly listed on a website as a Christian Against Christian Nationalism for any number of reasons, which I fully support. But the great thing about the campaign is in the last few years, we've developed many other entry points for engagement, including downloading resources that we have all kinds of resource, podcast series, discussion guides, explainers, things that you can share with friends and family, and that to use in your small group study or church study or just even for individual study to learn more about it. But we also are really working to set up local groups for action. And this is really something that I talk about in my book about the importance of local organizing. And so we have a whole page on our website about local groups where you can find, if there's already a group going in your area, find a place to connect with people. If you're interested in starting a group, reach out to us. We'll kind of let you know what's involved and give you some tools. But our purpose is really to connect people on the ground to people in their community who are interested in learning more and taking action together. Because I really think that is the key piece to, as we started, to how we're really going to end Christian nationalism, is to do it by building these communities, communities that extend beyond just Christians, extend in interfaith and working with secular allies as well, to get to know our communities, see what's really challenging us, and then dreaming together and working towards that more flourishing society that works for all of us, regardless of religious belief.
I think that's so cool. I mean, I really love the idea of bringing people together to talk about this, because it's so misunderstood and it's so mysterious to some people, and they hear the label, right? And they don't get it. They don't understand what it means. And maybe they feel afraid to even be able to talk about it. They don't have a safe space to do it because this person, Uncle Larry's going to explode if, you talk about that and it's uncomfortable. So they don't want to do it. And I just love the idea of bringing that together, because I do feel like the church in America we have become obsessed with power. And it's one of the things that scares me and that concerns me the most, more than anything else, is just we're longing to hold on to power, it seems like. And Jesus calls us to do the opposite. And it's a really hard message, to relinquish power and to relinquish control and to trust God and to have conviction, integrity, but to act in ways that love your enemy and your neighbor. And I just think that's a really cool way to do that. And I appreciate you doing that. I would just love to give you a chance to kind of make your, for this podcast, to kind of make your final appeal on why this is so important for people and our future to start to get into this conversation and to really understand it, and so that we can move forward. I'd love to hear your final thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I hope people are hearing, and we didn't focus too much on the history here, but this is a really old problem. This is not something that just popped up overnight. It's been growing for centuries. There have been, pockets of people taking it on, but then it kind of comes back. I think about Christian nationalism as kind of different high tides. And we're at a high tide right now. This is our moment. And it's different than other high tides in part because of the speed at which misinformation is traveling, because of the strong man of Trump and the second administration that is filled with people who won't say no to him, and some of the destruction of the rule of law and just democratic institutions. I don't think it's done, but I think we are definitely at a crisis moment. And so I think my appeal, and I'll make it broadly and then also to Christians, and then even more narrowly just to white Christians, right? I think the broad appeal is, if we care about pluralistic democracy, that this is our moment to show up, and that this moment requires the active engagement of every person in the project of democracy like we've never done before, right? Not just showing up on election day, not just calling or writing your member of Congress, although you need to do both of those things, but actually getting involved in the fabric of our community, and really showing what we the people looks like. To Christians, Christian nationalism is a form of idolatry. It is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus, and it violates our core of our faith, which is the gospel of love, and replaces it with this false idol of power. And so if we are really serious about this business of following Jesus, and listening and following his commands to love God through love of neighbor, then I think we have a religious imperative to show up in this moment. And then finally, to white Christians. We have done the most to both perpetuate white Christian nationalism, and we've benefited the most from it. And so this is the moment, I think, that we bear the greatest responsibility to do something about it. The impact of white Christian nationalism is felt most by everyone but us. But it's our responsibility, I think, to deal honestly with how white supremacy is motivating Christian nationalism, to talk openly and honestly and in hard ways with our communities about it, and then to work in ways that are truly collaborative and not perpetuating white supremacy in our joint work to do something about it in our communities.
Man, thank you so much for that appeal, Amanda. I think that was really well said. And I pray our audience is listening, and no matter where they fall in this, they understand the importance of this moment. Because I agree with you. We are in a key moment right now for our generation and in American history for us right now. And I'm just thankful for voices like you that are willing to get into the fray. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
No, I was going to say, thank you, Amanda. We really, really appreciate your time,
yes,
and everything, and just for all the advocacy that you're doing. And
yes,
how can people get your book? What's the website for BJC? And then we will send you off.
Well, you can get the book wherever you buy your books. But we do have a website, endchristiannationalism.com, where you can learn more about it and have links to where you can find how to end Christian nationalism. And then also check us out at bjconline.org and Christians Against Christian Nationalism.org. Lots of ways that you can subscribe to our list. We're sending out a ton of action alerts right now because there are lots of ways to take action in our communities, but also see about if it's interesting to you to connect on the ground, contact us about local groups that might be forming or should be formed in your area.
That's awesome. Well, thanks again, Amanda. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the program with us today.
Oh, it's been a great conversation. Thank you both.
You're very welcome. And to our friends and viewers, listeners, thanks, guys, for joining us. If you viewed us on YouTube, make sure you hack the algorithm, subscribe, like, all that stuff, because that lets us get this content out to more people. And this is the moment. We want to get this great content out, and we would love for you guys to do that. Well, guys, until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Thanks, and God bless. Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith and public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.